The situation is even more precarious when it comes to the regulation of artificial intelligence. Here, it is not even possible to say unequivocally whether it is the dysfunctionality or the functionality of the respective system that truly poses the risk. As of yet, it is not possible to make such an assessment because the possibilities and thus also the potential negative consequences of AI are still difficult to estimate. We cannot tell what we have to protect us against. Given this uncertainty, it is entirely understandable to adopt a better safe than sorry strategy and to restrict the use and development of AI as much as possible. However, this also involves a risk, particularly with regard to economic and other social developments. When the European Union stipulates in its AI Act that human responsibility must be assured in the case of risky applications of AI, one might ask whether this does justice to the phenomenon at all, or whether it is not rather in line with a certain idea that tells us, of course you are allowed to buy an electric toothbrush. And yes, of course, you may brush your teeth with it, but just beware, keep in mind one tiny little thing, don't turn it on. In this respect, however, a slow shift in thinking seems to be taking place in the political arena in Europe. The German Minister for Economic Affairs, for instance, recently spoke of the goal of transforming the entire European Union into a kind of new Silicon Valley. One may regard this perspective as either touchingly naive or visionary, possibly both. In any case, this goal is hardly compatible with the regulations that have been in place to date. So how can the regulatory role of law in dealing with risks in general and systemic risk in particular be determined from the perspective of informational administrative law? Against the background that I've tried to explain, it should at least be clear that a risk management in the ambitious sense mentioned above cannot be achieved through law. This is already evident from the fact that legal treatment as such is by no means neutral, but always already risky in itself. The possible excessive juridification of all areas of society has long been identified as a problem, and its potentially harmful consequences are the subject of in-depth discussion in the social sciences as well as in legal scholarship. Therefore, once again, the aim cannot be to eliminate and control risks, but only to transform them into other risks. However, with regard to typical modern cases, another assumption can be made. According to this assumption, the task of the law is not to eliminate risks, but rather conversely to create risks in the strict sense by transforming otherwise non-individually responsible threats of damage into attributable events. The paradigm for this procedure is the development of strict liability, an institution that is astonishing from a traditional point of view, which determines legal responsibility for behavior that is permissible in itself, even though it has not led to damage in a demonstrably culpable manner. What used to be considered just an unfortunate coincidence now becomes a case of liability. The same can be assumed with regard to the legal handling of so-called systemic risks. Obviously, the ultimate goal here is to prevent destructive cascade effects and to this end to create the necessary monitoring and control mechanisms, for example through reporting requirements and the above-mentioned risk assessment, while also institutionalizing interdependence interruptions. Yet maybe the main aim or the main function is to transform a prima facie incomprehensible amorphous event into the more structured form of a risk. Only through this construction, that is, the reduction of a more comprehensive complex to individual decisions and the corresponding decision makers, and the relationship between them, is it possible to take risk prevention and hazard control measures that target the now identifiable causes of the threat rather than merely managing the consequences? Instead of dikes, we're building wind turbines. However, this stylization of certain events as risks into risks is also risky, because it is associated with the danger of misallocating resources if the anticipated risk turns out to be a purely contingent or at any rate incorrectly attributed damaging event. The regulation of systemic risk can prove to be a systemic risk in and of itself. And this possibility may not only have to be taken into account and monitored by legislators, but also kept in mind when existing regulations are applied by the authorities and the courts and taken into account when interpreting said norms. The same applies to the transformation of risks into other risks overall. It always depends on selection criteria, the determination of which, as a decision, can only appear in the form of an accepted risk. For example, converting more visible, ad hoc imminent risks into less disruptive, less noticeable long-term risk, simply because this benefits a perspective oriented towards short-time intervals, such as election periods or annual reports to shareholders, this converting may seem obviously problematic. However, this evidence does not justify the reverse conclusion that longer-term risks should now be structurally favored over short-term risks. After all, in other contexts, the strategy of simply playing it by the ear in the face of overwhelming complexity is sometimes even considered as a specific rationality. And this idea is not entirely unfounded. It could indeed be the case that solutions that are reasonably resistant to disappointment and cannot be discredited by day-to-day events thrive on a kind of trust that could be described using a rather unpleasant term as ideology. This also casts a certain shadow over the alternative to political or economic short-sightedness oriented towards immediate benefits. The weakness of one approach cannot be converted into the strength of another. From a specifically legal perspective, a method that is in other legal contexts already widely popular seems to offer a solution to the question of appropriate risk selection. The balancing, that is, the weighing up of the options. On closer inspection, however, this strategy offers little comfort, for the method does not answer the question of what exactly should and can be balanced against each other. On the one hand, this technique thus merely postpones the selection problem once again, and at the same time obscures it. On the other hand, the openness of the procedure counteracts the limiting, and precisely because of this limiting, the decision-enabling function of classic legal conditional programs. In this sense, despite its enormous popularity among lawyers, particularly also, as I know, among Brazilian lawyers, the technique of balancing constitutes a risk in itself. Another idea that is often mentioned in this context of justifying risk selection is the reference to the particular severity of an impending impairment which is supposed to be caused by the irreversibility of the consequences of a decision. Once again, this may look quite convincing at first glance. On closer inspection, though, the argument seems more rhetorical than theoretically convincing. After all, as if there were ever any decision that could actually be undone. From the perspective of other social systems, the frequently criticized decline in the predictability of legal decisions, allegedly associated with the balancing model, however, may not be seen solely as a disadvantage. It is possible that the process, precisely because of its seemingly problematic effect, offers a specific, functionally added value that could help to explain more precisely why the law, in particular, is attributed such a prominent role in managing risks, even though it is actually just as incapable of doing so as all the other social spheres. In this view, the proverbial wisdom that in court and on the high seas we are in God's hands serves as a welcome relief from responsibility for decision makers, particularly in the political, administrative, or economic spheres. Thus, legal defeats need not to be regarded as predictable events, with the result that corresponding miscalculations must be attributed to failures on the part of the economy or politics, for example. If these failures were recognized as such, they would force, or at least suggest, future changes in one's own behavior. By contrast, if legal decisions can instead be regarded as a specific, incalculable risk of the law as such, then this alleged incalculability can be used to justify one's own resistance to learning. Something can be done about one's own mismanagement, but there's nothing you can do about mere strokes of fate. This form of literally fatalistic attribution not only serves to protect the individual actors involved, the resulting refusal to adapt one's behavior may occasionally also be functionally useful for the entire organization or even for the entire system. At the same time, however, it is, unsurprisingly, a risk in and of itself. I thank you very much for your attention.